Hey, little buddies, it's Uncle Rick from the Uncle Rick Audiobook Club, where you and I enjoy reading great books together. On today's podcast, I'll be reading a chapter or two from one of the exciting books in the club. I hope you enjoy it. Stick around at the end of the podcast, and I'll tell you how you can listen to the whole book, as well as tons of others that you are going to love.
A Visit with Uncle Rick, a podcast by Rick Boyer of Uncle Rick Audios.
Chapter 4. Bombs Japan, bails out, captured. Lieutenant Farrow, with his crew of 4, including DeShazer, left the Hornet at about 9:20 a.m. In spite of their slow speed, they reached Japan about 1 o'clock that afternoon. The trip was uneventful. Very few airplanes were seen, and these apparently did not notice the American bomber approaching. Much of the distance over open water was flown at very low altitude, perhaps only 100 feet. When Japan was reached, however, they found high clouds. In order to get over the mountains, it was necessary to fly up through the clouds at an altitude of about 7,000 feet. To their surprise, they found people living on these mountains. Much of the flying at this altitude was just above the treetops. The Japanese people, of course, were surprised. Apparently they did not understand that this was an enemy airplane, for some of them waved a greeting. At one time, DeShazer noticed an old gray-bearded gentleman walking along a mountain pathway using a cane. He glanced back at the plane and threw himself flat on the ground as the plane rushed by only a few feet above him. The target which was assigned to DeShazer's plane was not Tokyo, but Nagoya, about 300 miles south of the capital city. When they reached Nagoya, the day was beautiful and the sun was shining. DeShazer reports that it did not look much like the maps they had been shown. As they approached the first target in Nagoya, the pilot said, "Get set to drop the bombs at 500 feet. There's the first target." DeShazer, in charge of the actual bombing, looked straight ahead and saw some oil storage tanks. The plane went right over the top of the highest tank at 500 feet. DeShazer looked down the angle line, that for precaution had been substituted for a bomb sight, and let the incendiary bomb go. He tried to drop another bomb on another tank and then suddenly noticed that 3 bombs had been released instead of 2. Let us listen to DeShazer's own story. "We were making a complete turn and I smelled smoke. I wanted to see how an oil refinery looked when it was on fire. To the left of us I saw where the first bombs had dropped. There was fire all over the tank, but it had not blown up yet. What I was smelling, however, was powder of the shells that were being shot at us instead of the bombs I had dropped. I had noticed a little black smoke cloud right in front of us, and evidently the hole in the nose of our airplane allowed the smoke to come inside. We went over a big factory-looking building and dropped the last incendiary. We skimmed along down a valley on our way out to the ocean. I was getting ready to shoot. There's something about being shot at that makes you want to shoot back. I had read in the newspapers one time about a German aviator shooting at French people, and I thought it was a mean thing to do. I made up my mind while on the Hornet that I would not shoot at civilians, but after they shot at us, I changed my mind. I saw a man standing in a fishing boat, waving as we came along. He thought we were Japanese. I thought that I would show him that we weren't. I shot a few shots near him, and the poor fellow stopped waving. I wasn't a very good shot, however, and therefore no harm was done. We flew along the coast of Japan, intending to fly on the 13th parallel to Shuai in China. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, little buddies. We saw several of the other B-52s, but did not follow any of them. When night came, we saw dimly the coast of China, but the fog was so thick we could not tell what part of China we were approaching. Our navigator, Lieutenant Barr, was doing lots of paperwork. He said we should be over Shuai. The pilot circled, calling on the radio all the time. No answer came back. The fog cleared off a little. We could see a town below, but no airfield. In the tanks we had gasoline enough now for only 1 hour. We had to do something, and Lieutenant Farrow was anxious to save the B-25. It was a good old gas burner. With a hole in the nose, it had already stayed in the air for more than 13 hours. By flying beyond Japanese-held territory, we could get to Kaiyan in Free China, where more gasoline was stored. We might be able to see the airfield or get a response from the Chinese radio operator. After we had flown for 1 hour, we saw a town. Our gasoline was nearly gone. We circled the town, calling and looking for lights from an airfield, but to no avail. Finally, Lieutenant Farrow said, "We got to jump." It was 11:40 p.m., by the same time as when we left the Hornet. The airplane was at an altitude of 3,000 feet. I watched Lieutenant Barr go first. Then I jumped. It wasn't exactly a jump. I put my legs out, and the wind knocked them against the fuselage of the airplane so hard that I had to push against the door frame in order to get out of the opening on the lower side of the fuselage. I gave a shove and then watched the plane go over my head. I lost my hat as the wind was shrieking over me. When the plane had gone beyond me, I pulled the ripcord and was given a hard but welcome jerk as the parachute immediately opened. I watched the light go out of sight from the opening in the fuselage of the plane. Soon the sound of the motors died out. Everywhere I looked, it was dark. The fog was thick around me, and I felt a strange sensation of loneliness. I had no way of knowing that I was coming down, since I could not see the ground, and there was no sensation of wind since the parachute had opened. I began to wonder if I would have to sit up here all night. Suddenly I hit the earth with an awful jolt. The place where I landed was the final resting grounds of a Chinaman. I threw my arms around that mound of dirt and gave it a big hug. I was glad to be back on the ground, even if it was a good long way from the USA. I saw several mounds of dirt and noticed that I was on a knoll. Then I realized it was a Chinese graveyard. All around were rice fields, which were under water at that time of the year. I found out later that at the very time I was coming down the parachute, my mother was awakened from her sleep and was praying for me. Well, that's great. DeShazer hits the ground, and his mother is praying for him. Interesting how God calls people to prayer at special times when that prayer is needed. DeShazer was too stunned to realize that some ribs were fractured in the landing. He was able, however, to move about and to walk. He shot his pistol into the air several times, but there was no response from any direction. He then cut the parachute to pieces with his knife and used a portion of the silk to protect his head from the rain. He started walking. It was difficult to find his way around the rice fields, for everywhere it was muddy and slippery. He does not know how long he walked, but in due time he came to a little brick building which apparently had been used as a shrine by some Chinese farmer. It was beside running water and had irons to be used for burning incense. Although it was very small, he was able to clear out enough space to get in and barely have room to sit. It was a shelter from the rain. Through sheer weariness, he fell asleep and did not waken until daylight. Immediately he began to look for a road. After walking some distance, he came to a path. As he walked along this path, he began meeting people. No one, however, seemed to be interested, and no one seemed to be excited or suspicious. This made him think that he might be in Chinese territory. Now understand, he was in China. He knew he was in China, but the Japanese had invaded China and taken over part of it. That's what it means by Chinese territory or Japanese territory. From time to time, he would stop a man and try to get him to tell whether it was Japanese territory or not. Seemingly, no one understood his questions, or perhaps they were unwilling to say. He finally came to a store. He went in. Here he wrote a few words on a pad, but the Chinese storekeeper could give him no information. Once again he took to the road and walked for several hours. Finally he came to a main road and a telephone line. This was a source of real encouragement, for it appeared he might be able to get help. The few hours of walking along Chinese farms and seeing Chinese homes gave DeShazer his first sight of the awful living conditions of the Chinese. He said this: "I could see inside their mud houses, chickens, pigs, and children wading around together in filthy mud inside the house. The people had heads about the size of a 4-year-old child in America. The skin on their faces was wrinkled and old-looking. I didn't expect to find out much from them. I didn't care to ask them for anything to eat, although I was getting very hungry." He continued walking down the main highway. In due time he came to a group of houses which obviously constituted a military base. He saw some soldiers outside washing clothes in a ditch. That was one time he wished he knew how to tell the Chinese from the Japanese. Were these soldiers friends, or were they enemies? Should he go up to them and make himself known? No, he thought best not to do so. He walked farther down the road until he came to another house. Gathering all the courage possible, he went to this house to make inquiry. Inside he found 2 young soldiers playing with some Chinese children. He started talking by sign language, and of course he also used English. He used the word America and pointed to himself. He then pointed to one of the soldiers and asked, China or Japan? The soldier replied, China. He had his mixed givings. Fear seemed to take possession of him. He fixed his .45 pistol so a bullet was in the chamber and the hammer drawn back. He knew the pistol contained 7 good bullets, and he was ready to shoot it out if they were Japanese. As he stood there, he began to feel perhaps it was better for him to leave the house and go on his way. Just as he started to back away toward the door, to his consternation he found 10 soldiers armed with bayonets, pistols, and swords standing at the entrance. As he yelled, he was holding his hand on the pistol. Instantly they hollered back, China. DeShazer says, I didn't want to start shooting the Chinese, so I let him come in. The soldiers came in, succeeded in getting him to shake hands, patted him on the back, and tried to act like old-time friends. Even though it was difficult to talk to each other, they succeeded in getting him to go along with them down the road to a camp. As they were walking along, they stopped for a moment, and to DeShazer's further consternation, he found that a bayonet was against his back. Suddenly guns were pointing at him from every direction. The leader of the group then reached over and took his pistol from the holster. In due time they reached the camp. The officer who met them seemed somewhat friendly. He talked abusively to the other soldiers who came out to look at him, and they quickly disappeared into their houses like a bunch of frightened children. DeShazer was seated at a table, and a man began asking him questions. The questioner knew English fairly well. It was now perfectly obvious to DeShazer that the men were Japanese, not Chinese. When this fact dawned upon him, he was completely discouraged. His own description of this experience indicates that his feelings were at an even lower ebb than months later when he was being severely punished in prison. Nevertheless, he tried to let on that he did not realize they were Japanese. In this state of mind, he seems to have been both morose and courageous. To practically every question which was asked, his answer was, I don't know, or I won't tell. In his own words, he says, the Japanese finally found out that I wouldn't tell them anything they wanted to know, so they asked me if I wanted to eat. I told them that that wasn't a bad idea. They gave me some hot cakes with apple butter. Perhaps it was not apple butter, but that's as close to it as I can describe it. The taste was different from anything that I had ever eaten. It had an oriental tang. The tea and food, however, made me feel a lot better. He saw pictures of some high-ranking officers on the wall and asked the interpreter the names of the officers, thinking this would give him some idea for sure where he was. The interpreter mentioned several names, but they meant nothing to DeShazer. Finally, it seems that the officer in charge, thinking that DeShazer knew for certain that they were Japanese, instructed the interpreter to tell him point blank, you are in the hands of the Japanese. Now all hope was gone, but questionings continued. Aren't you afraid? Asked the interpreter. What should I be afraid of? Jake asked. For some reason or other, this question brought up the question of American slang. They had an interesting discussion regarding this subject. A short time later, he was taken to another town. He reports that in spite of all his efforts, he was never able to find out the name of either of these towns. Here, however, he learned that 4 of his comrades had also been picked up. They met for the first time the next morning and were photographed together on the front steps of a building.
Thanks for listening to A Visit with Uncle Rick today, little buddies. That's all we have time for right now. But remember, the whole book is available on the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club at UncleRickAudios.com. Why not ask Mom and Dad about joining my club today?